One thing that mass immigration does is it can reveal the ugliest side of people. And we have been seeing this in the last few years, both in Europe and in the United States. You can see this in the rhetoric of conservatives, not just conservatives who are big voices online or on the radio or the television, but conservatives that you may know in your own personal life. And they may say things like, well, you know, these migrants who are crossing the border, these Mexicans who are crossing the border illegally, you know, they're just nothing but a bunch of leeches and bloodsuckers. And they basically start using language akin to stuff that the Nazis used when they wanted to justify their own demonic, eugenic, Darwinistic policies. Bloodsuckers, useless eaters, leeches, things like that. It's very Hitlerian. We've been seeing this also in Europe with the nationalist phenomena going on there, and how you have, for example, Italian nationalists talking about, you know, these evil gypsies and how we have to get rid of all of them by any means necessary. Now, I know gypsies aren't migrants, but the mass migration that has been taking place into Europe has amplified these views even more and has popularized them, actually, because it's not just the gypsies, it's the migrants. And, you know, now we have more bloodsuckers in our country. You have, for example, Frauke Petry talking about how, you know, this mass migration, soon it's going to start a Darwinian war between the Germans and the Arabs. And you have Bjorn Höcke talking about how Africans and Europeans, they have different biological habits of reproduction and multiplying. Almost like, you know, talking about human beings as though they are bacteria. Different biological habits and ways. And how Africans, you know, they are part of this genetic strata. And he starts taking things from the, you know, the Charles Murray type geneticist, eugenists, essentially. So immigration, migration, it just shows the ugly side of people. Not all people, but it can show the ugly side of a lot of people. And people start getting very nasty with their language, and they can get very nasty with their actions, sometimes downright murderous. We saw this last year when a neo-Nazi went into a Walmart in El Paso and just slaughtered 22 people because he wanted to hunt down Mexicans. Yeah, it's pretty barbaric. But it's not just Europe and America where we've been seeing these things. We've also been seeing these things in North Africa. Specifically, I'm talking about Libya. When Gaddafi was ruling Libya, he wanted to create something called the African Union. So basically replicating the European Union, but an African version of that. And so he wanted a united Africa led by, of course, Libya. And so he did an open door policy for immigration into Libya from African countries. And so if you were a Sudanese guy or a Nigerian, you could enter Libya. And there was essentially open borders for Africans. Just like how within the EU bloc you have the Schengen zone, where people can travel from European country to European country as long as they have an EU passport. So there were two reasons why Gaddafi did this. One, it was to get cheap labor from black Africans. And secondly, it was to threaten the Europeans. Because, and this is, Gaddafi knew this 100%, Libya has for a long time been a corridor through which African migrants go to Europe. So African migrants who want to go to Europe, many times they will go into Europe through Libya. And you see this today. I mean, how many times have we heard about migrants from Africa going into Europe and they travel through Libya? Albeit they go through Libya with a lot of torment because a lot of them end up getting murdered, people get killed, their organs get taken for the black market, women get forced into sex slavery. It's pretty nasty what happens in Libya. So Gaddafi knew that African migrants would want to go to Europe through Libya. So he said, hey, come to Libya. So a lot of Africans were going to Libya to work, but they were also going into Libya to get into Europe. So hey, we don't have to go through any sort of border security to get into Libya. That's just one step we don't have to worry about anymore if we want to migrate into Europe. And so why did Gaddafi do this? It was to threaten the Europeans in order to get concessions from the Europeans. So, hey, Europe, I want you to do this, something with trade, something with economy, whatever. If you don't do this, then more blacks are going to go into Europe. It's the same thing that Erdogan has been doing since 2015. Hey, Europe, help me against Bashar al-Assad. If not, I'm going to just throw these migrants into Europe. And that's what Erdogan is doing right now. He's sending thousands and thousands of migrants through Turkey into Greece in order to force the EU to assist Turkey in its war in Syria. But here's the thing, is Turkey has absorbed millions of migrants. This is a tea from the garden. Mint leaves mixed with a little bit of lemon balm. It's very good. And so far, Turkey has absorbed around 3.7 million migrants from the Syrian war. What has that caused? It has caused a boost in Turkish nationalism because a lot of Turks are very racist. Now, I'm sure people in Turkey don't want to hear this, but it's a reality. Just as we have to face the reality of racism both in Europe and the United States, there's definitely racism in Turkey. I remember talking to a guy who was in the military, and he was stationed in Turkey for quite some time. He was stationed there long enough to get a feel for the culture and the political and cultural atmosphere. And he told me that Turkey is extremely racist. And the way he described it to me was, it is Southern slave master abusing his slave type of racism. That's how horrific the racism is in Turkey. This is what he told me. It is an extremely racist country. And it doesn't matter even if you're Muslim. You're not Turkish, they don't like you. You're not of that Anatolian / Seljukian Byzantine ancestry, they don't like you. So a lot of Turks have been voting for the Nationalist Party in Turkey. There is a Nationalist Party in Turkey, and it has a huge history of racism given the fact that it was the Nationalist Party that oversaw the Armenian genocide and also the genocide of the Assyrians and the Greeks living within the Ottoman Empire back in the first half of the 20th century. And also the fact that there were a number of thinkers in the Nationalist Party who were open eugenists. And I'll put in an article underneath the video that I wrote about this subject that you can read about so you can learn more about this subject. So the presence of all these millions of migrants living in Turkey has caused a nationalist backlash to the point where Turks are showing open racism against people even though they're Muslim. And if Turkey continues to absorb these migrants, this nationalist uprising could actually get pretty worse and could boil over to the point that you could have violence. And in fact, we've already seen violence against migrants. I remember, I want to say last year, there was an incident in Istanbul or Ankara, one of those major cities, where a Syrian-owned clothing store was broken into by Turkish nationalist thugs, and it was ransacked because the store owners were Syrian. A number of decades ago, there was a huge riot in Turkey against Armenians. And this was very recent. And it's all, in fact, the racism in Turkey is so strong, the CIA was using open neo-Nazis, Turkish neo-Nazis, to form paramilitaries against the Soviet Union. In case the Soviet Union ever invaded Turkey or Europe, they would have these neo-Nazis ready to go. And Gladio was doing this not just in Turkey, but Belgium, Germany, Italy, those countries as well. So if you look at this whole strata, this political strata in Turkey of racism and its connections to NATO and Gladio, I mean, it's all interconnected. It's very strong and it's very heavily backed by political entities. And bringing in all these migrants in Turkey could have a political backlash in Turkey, a nationalist surge in Turkey, and also the fact that these migrants have been boiling over into Europe. That has caused a violent backlash. We saw this just recently in Germany. Some guy went into a Hisha bar and killed like 12 Kurdish people. We saw this in Chemnitz last year, and there were riots. People were turning over cars. They wanted to get rid of the foreigners and the migrants. And that was in Germany, Chemnitz, Germany. So what does this have to do with Libya? Well, a similar thing happened in Libya. Gaddafi allowed all these Africans to enter the country. The Africans were doing the low-wage work, the low-wage jobs. And oops, something just dropped. And this is what happens when you're like in the moment here. The Libyans, a lot of them didn't like that. A lot of them got extremely upset about this. And there was an incident in Libya. It was in a town called Zawiya. And there were a number of black Africans who were living there. And a bunch of racist Libyans started a mob uprising in which they went around lynching any Africans they saw. And dozens of black Africans were lynched. It's like something you'd read about from the 1800s, early 1900s, clan level violence type stuff. That happened in Libya when Muammar Gaddafi was ruling it. You can look this up. It's the Zawiya scenario, the Zawiya racist occurrence. Zawiya is spelled Zawiya, and this happened in Libya. And the people who murdered these Africans, they weren't just angry at the blacks because, you know, they took our jobs. They were also very angry at Gaddafi. And so one thing that the Zawiya lynchings showed was that Libya was not as united as Gaddafi was making it out to be. And there were plenty of people who were enraged at Gaddafi. And one of the specific reasons as to why they were so enraged was because Gaddafi was allowing all of these blacks into their country. So part of the revolution against Gaddafi wasn't just that he was this evil dictator, as all of these American propagandists wanted to make it seem. A lot of these people who hated Gaddafi were just pure racist. And that's the reason why after they murdered Gaddafi, black Africans living in Libya were terrified for their lives, and a lot of them ended up dead. A lot of people ended up in cages like animals because there was some extremely vicious racism that was in Libya, and it's still there. And so that's why I say immigration, migration can really reveal the ugliest side of humanity. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.